today. Thanks for attending the Human Connection Conference and for attending this session in particular. Wish we could be gathering today in person in the spirit of what we're talking about today, but I also appreciate that doing this virtually gives us a unique opportunity for others to attend and join in the conversation that might not otherwise be able to. I apologize in advance if I'm lacking a bit of my usual energy, but I'm just recovering from 4 days of a nasty non-COVID bug. I also want to acknowledge that I'm dressed down a little more than I might otherwise for a conference, but I couldn't help but, and it's not an effort to recapture any lost or misspent youth. It literally is an effort to rep an incredible brand and movement that my good friend Pete Bombaci is building around human connection. With that in mind, we're here to talk about why investing in helping people build deep, strong, and diverse human connections in the workplace is important for business and important for business leaders. While I don't want to steal any of our panelists' thunder, I'd hazard a guess that they're all going to say it's mission critical. Now, the knee-jerk reaction would be to say that the reason we're talking about human connection is we've had 3 years of being separated from each other because of a global pandemic, and that the opportunities and challenges of returning to some new form of hybrid way of working, create an intense amount of built-up pressure and desire to reconnect face-to-face. But the truth is that the power of human connection has been foundational to business, frankly, for all of human history. And it's important to business leaders is much more widespread than just the response to the pandemic in terms of its impacts on recruitment, retention, culture, growth, and inclusion, to name just a few. In a moment, I'm going to ask each of our esteemed guests and panelists to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Nancy, then Pete, then Connie, who will then move immediately into sharing her insights and perspectives from years of work and research in this area. Before I do, I want to set a couple of expectations for our time together, as an hour will go by pretty quickly. Our goal is to reserve some time at the end to take a few questions from you, our fantastic audience. I'd encourage you to use the chat function, share questions that you may have as we go along. Those that we can't answer in the session today, we're going to take away and hopefully be able to respond to and follow up with other topics. We're going to spend the majority of our time hearing from you three. If you, so that, sorry, and that's it. So without any further ado, Nancy, please get us going.
Thanks, Paul. I wanted to really say how thrilled I am to be here and honored to be speaking at this amazing, inspiring summit here. And we share our love for Pete Bombaci because I'm on the board of the GenWell Project, and it's amazing and inspiring how one human being can make such a huge difference in the human impact movement. So we'll get to meet him shortly, but I'll say that I'm Nancy McKay, and I'm the founder and CEO of McKay CO Forums. And our dream is to populate the world with inspiring leaders. And we believe that business leaders are our best hope for making our world a more inspiring world today. And that's why we offer our 1,200 members across Canada, around the world, peer support and human connection, so that CEOs, executives, and business owners don't continue the old school methods of do it all yourself. They actually reach out, connect with other human beings, and help each other solve their toughest problems and maximize their best opportunities. And I just so believe that there's never been a time in the world where we as human beings really need to get connected. We need to inspire people. We need to educate them on why it's so important to be connected with other amazing human beings. So thank you, Paul, for chairing our panel here and for inviting me to be sharing the screen with you.
Great. Pete?
Yeah, hi everybody. Pete Bombaci, founder of the GenWell Project, and big fan of Paul and Nancy, both members of our board at the GenWell Project. Really excited to be here today. First off, to hear Connie Hadley speak about the research that she's been doing on workplace well-being, but also to be a part of this conversation. Having led the global movement for human connection for about 6 years right now, Many times up until the global pandemic, most people weren't interested in this conversation. But as Nancy just touched on, I think there's a need to have this conversation more than ever before. So great to be here. Great to be part of this conversation. Most importantly, glad to be raising the consciousness of the need for this as part of most business leaders' future plans.
Thanks, Pete. And Connie, take it away.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background about myself, and then I will be sharing some more about my own research, but also the research of lots of other people as well today. So I am an organizational psychologist. I study people at work. And for a long time, I've been interested in how people get through their work days when they're feeling stressed and dealing with challenging situations. And I've known for a long time how important peer support is, social support at work. And in fact, I think for a long time, I would characterize myself as a relationships researcher, not a loneliness researcher. But over time, I've become more and more concerned about the number of people who don't feel they have good relationships at work and would be classified as lonely. And for the last few years, especially, I've been focusing on that more squarely in my research. So I look forward to sharing a little bit more about that, as I said, but also about what else is happening with other researchers around the world. Now, Nancy, I am sure you have many great CEO stories, but I wanted to start off with my own CEO story. So I was at a conference recently, and a CEO was invited. I'm not going to give any details for privacy reasons, but a CEO was invited to speak about the future of work and where he saw things heading, particularly regarding remote work and hybrid work and the future of the office. And what I was really struck by was this CEO started off not talking about what the employees were saying or what the statistics were looking like, but about how he felt about it. And he expressed emotion about this whole post-pandemic world in a really poignant and thoughtful way. The first emotion he expressed feeling was sadness. He said that he felt like when he walked around the empty offices that he had thrown a big party and nobody had come. And that really struck me because it's an example of what it can feel like to be lonely. Now, this CEO did not, in any point of his talk, say he was lonely. But when I hear words like feeling like nobody came to your party and feeling like disconnected from people, that's what I hear. I hear stories about loneliness. And I think this example just shows you how much the pandemic environment and all the changes that we had to make over the last 3 years have affected everyone from the top down in the organization. So if you are feeling disconnected and not as tied to your colleagues as you either once were or as much as you would like to be, then you really are not alone. And I want you to know that. So with that, let me turn into some remarks here to give you a bit of an overview of the landscape and what we know so far. There are 3 major takeaways that I'm hoping you'll glean from my talk. The first is that workplace loneliness is a big deal. It's really damaging to the people of the organization as well as to the organization itself. The second is that loneliness as a concept is really hard to get your arms around for a number of reasons. 2 of the characteristics of loneliness are relevant here. One is that it's subjectively determined, and I'll explain more about that. But the second is that it's contextually dependent, and I'll explain that. And then the third takeaway that I hope you will get from this part of my talk is that it's really a complicated issue to resolve. I cannot give you straightforward answers because of the nature of loneliness. But I do think there are lots more things that we can do. So I'll be sharing some ideas for leaders as well as for everybody, no matter what your position in the organization. So with that, let me start with the first one about this is a big deal. Now, some of you who attend probably are familiar with the statistics, and I'll only cite a few of them here. There have been growing reports that help us quantify the impact of loneliness on the workplace. The UK is far advanced from the Canada or the US, as well as most other countries in terms of its study of this. There's a monetization report of the impact on employers that came out in 2019, right before the pandemic hit, that said about 2.5 billion pounds annually was being lost by employers due to the aspects of loneliness that might impact productivity, absenteeism, turnover, healthcare costs. And Cigna is a well-known US health provider that has also done a lot of research on this. And they've estimated that in the US that about $400 billion of lost revenue for US employers. And again, this was right before the pandemic hit. So that's a lot of money. And that helps kind of wake things up from an organizational standpoint, if you want to think about it in terms of the hitting their bottom line. But I like to focus more on the human aspect of it and what it costs employees. And again, some of you may be familiar, there have been some excellent meta-analyses done in looking at this as a social health and public health calamity, and it affects mortality rates, it affects suicide rates, and lots of other aspects of the workforce in terms of their mental, physical, and emotional health. So think about it. If you have a significant number of employees who are lonely, they may not only be less productive and not working as well with others, but they may be the people who you're finding having higher healthcare costs. Maybe they have some aspects of things you would never attribute to loneliness, but we know it can be a risk factor for things like cancer and dementia and diabetes and other types of illnesses. So indirectly and directly, loneliness has a huge cost for the people of the organization and the organization itself financially. So that's number one. I hope everyone will kind of pay attention to this. I think we can post in the chat links to the Cigna website, which has lots of resources available. And you can look up the UK's Loneliness Project to learn more from their standpoint. And of course, the GenWell Project has been doing a great amount of research as well on this topic that I encourage you to check out. In terms of, though, thinking about this as a lot of big costs that were happening because of the pandemic itself, that's a misperception of what's going on here. The pandemic did make things worse, but things were already going in the wrong direction before the pandemic. So our current Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, had an article in 2017 in Harvard Business Review that called it the workplace loneliness epidemic. And he talked about how people were feeling throughout the different kinds of industries and different types of jobs, feeling more and more disconnected from others. So you might want to put that link in the chat as well for people to check out. So this is a pre-pandemic problem. It's a big problem. And yes, it has gotten worse, as that CEO talked about in his reflections on what he'd learned from the last few years. So that's bad news. But I also want to share a little bit about how to tackle it. But before I can, I want to explain more about how do you know if you're lonely or if other people in your workforce are lonely. And it's a great question, because first, thinking about it from a self-diagnosis standpoint, we have a lot of stigmas associated with feeling lonely. We tend not to want to believe that's something that we're experiencing. And sometimes people can misread their own signals. So I was working with an executive who came to me who wanted to talk about changing jobs because he thought he didn't like his job or the industry anymore. And after a series of conversations, it became clear that he actually didn't mind the work itself. He just felt like he didn't have anybody at work who he could really rely on, who knew him, who cared about him. And for him, that was really distressing. But he was misinterpreting that distress as a work-related stress. And it was really a people-related stress. So that's one thing to think about. Like, are you really reading your own signals correctly? But the other thing about it from an organizational standpoint that makes it hard is not only may people not report it accurately because they don't recognize it in themselves, but it's a really hard thing to get your arms around unless you specifically ask about it. So you can't extrapolate from like a broad engagement question, are people lonely? You can't do a culture survey and find out if people are lonely. You have to ask some really specific questions. And even in the specific questions, you have to be careful which ones you ask. So you may have heard the UCLA loneliness scale is one of the gold standards that's been used to measure loneliness for many decades. And there's a shorter version as well that many people use, but that's not really specific to the workplace. It's about loneliness in general. But one advantage it does have, besides lots of scientific rigor behind it, is that it doesn't use the word lonely, because that can be a trigger that can prevent people from reporting it, especially in a workplace where they may feel like there'd be some negative consequences to admitting that. Just as a reference point, when the UK was studying loneliness, they kind of did a comparison of using indirect measures that didn't say they were lonely and then a direct measure asked about loneliness. And they found that 30% more people could be categorized as lonely in the measure that didn't mention loneliness. So as an employer, to get your arms around this, you got to be really careful to understand, what are the tools and techniques you can use to really find out how people are feeling. So that's step one. But the other aspect that's important to know about loneliness is not only is it subjectively determined and something that people have stigma associated with, but it's really context specific. So going back to this measure, the UC loneliness measure, which I use in my own research sometimes, is not asking about where you feel lonely or with what types of people. So I have some measures that I've adapted for my research where we take those original ones and add things like in the workplace or with people at work. So simple little tweaks, but help people kind of ground the social context that they're thinking about. Because we do know about loneliness that, like many other socially determined situations and emotions, it can change. So you might have someone who is extremely socially satisfied outside of work. And if you ask them a global survey, they may be thinking about those friends and family and say, no, I'm fine. I have plenty of networks that I'm comfortable with. But then when you ask them specifically about work, they may find themselves answering, well, actually, I don't really have that many close colleagues or people that I feel would have my back. So it's context specific, which makes it, again, tricky to measure and also tricky to recognize in yourself. But on the positive side, what that does lead us to, which is my last takeaway, which is there are things you can do about it. So think about it this way. If loneliness were a personality trait, there'd be a lot less we could do about it. If loneliness, once you were lonely in one aspect of your life, you'd be lonely across all other aspects. Well, that's tough because then as an employer, you'd have to be solving their loneliness at home and at work. But because it can be context specific, it gives you an opportunity to dive into those interventions about what the workplace context is that may be contributing to loneliness. So Mark Mortensen and I wrote an article called "Are Your Team Members Lonely?" And we were looking specifically at people who worked in teams, which is really common in knowledge work. And those tend to be the workers that have more flexibility for being remote and hybrid. And we found that actually there wasn't a positive relationship between being on a team and being lonely. In fact, sometimes it goes the other direction. And sometimes when you're actually on a team, or in our case, we found people on lots of teams, you can feel more lonely because in your mind, you've got lots of people you talk to all the time. So if you're feeling that discontent or disconnection, it seems like it's something about you, not about the workplace. And so we provided some advice on things you can do to change the way you design teams, for example, to create more social connection points. And those are things like keeping your teams stable for longer. So as much as we love agile teams, a 2 or 3 week team is going to provide you fewer opportunities to really build those connections. Also, things like keeping members more committed to one team instead of splintering their attention across many. Holding people on the team as a more fixed membership for longer also allows people to kind of feel closer and more connected to each other. So are things you can do to modify the environment that will help people feel less lonely. The other thing that we want to talk about are things that leaders can do. And some of the advice for leaders is exactly the same advice I'd give to them if they ask me, how do you create more of a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging feeling within the organization? Because belonging is a close cousin to feeling connection of any kind. In this case, they were talking about belonging based on some aspect of your personal characteristics. But if you don't feel belonging, you're very unlikely to also feel super connected to other people. So some of those interventions are doing things like building psychological safety. That means really providing social norms and examples, starting with the leader, about opening up to others, being a little bit vulnerable. Maybe it's admitting a mistake or something you're concerned about, or like the CEO did in front of a room full of senior executives from lots of other companies saying he felt sad. I mean, that was a moment of vulnerability, but it can help bring people in, bring people together. And that's the same thing I would say if you wanted to set up this environment for people to bring diverse viewpoints to the forefront. So creating psychological safety is something that leaders have a lot of influence over. They can also do specific behaviors to try to create more social support among the employee base themselves to build those connections. And I'm not just talking about virtual happy hours here. I think it's something that's more important to be thinking about is giving specific examples of the types of support that people can give to each other that is likely to create sort of strength and compassion. And so those can be things, if you think about social support, there are lots of types. There's emotional support, that's just sort of commiserating with people or celebrating good things with people. There's esteem support, meaning helping people feel good about themselves and their contributions. Informational support, instrumental support, that's really helping people get their jobs done or solve problems that they have. And then last, there's social companionship, which would be the happy hour version. That's the unstructured sort of, people just getting a chance to have close, unscripted sort of social time together. But there are many other ways of building those bonds, as I just mentioned, if you think about that. So I'm working on a paper right now with a group at Microsoft, and we're looking at what are the kinds of reward systems and performance management systems that can be put into place to encourage people and train people to be more of those kinds of very types of supportive colleagues to each other so that everybody gets the kind of social support that they're looking for. So I'm going to stop there because I really want to hear from the other panelists as well. But those are just some of my thoughts on workplace loneliness.
Connie, thanks so much. I think you've done an incredible job of setting the stage for this topic and sharing so much of your knowledge and experience and insights and work really around this area. Love to using that as a base, Nancy, call on you to talk a little bit from your vantage point, working with senior executives, business leaders day to day on the kind of gnarly problems that they face in their businesses. Like, where does this issue and topic sit on their agenda? Where are you seeing this, and what of Connie's remarks resonated with you as you think about that challenge? And just before I get you to launch in, I'm gonna shout out to the audience. We would love to have your questions, either from Connie's remarks or things that you brought into the table, because we are going to leave some time at the end, and we'd love to be able to respond to you. So just an encouragement to use that group chat if you can to share some questions along the way. Nancy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Paul. And to answer your question about what really resonated with Connie's information, I could listen to her all day long. I mean, it was like practical tools for every single human being on the planet to become self-aware of and to be vulnerable and to there's nothing wrong with saying I feel lonely or I feel sad or whatever that emotion is, and to be able to reach out to other people for support. And that's what it's all about. And I started McKay's CEO Forum 17 years ago because I could see that it was lonely at the top. I thought as CEOs, we all have the same issues and challenges. And it's so hard to find people to surround ourselves with that are agenda free, that are going to just treat us as human beings. Like CEOs, we're no better than anyone else. We're just human beings jumping out of bed in the morning, wanting to make a contribution. And we're human. We have challenges with business and with family and our health and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, gosh, we all have the same issues and challenges. What if we came together and we helped each other? Like we actually got connected as human beings and we parked our egos. We just parked our egos and just showed up and just be vulnerable and put it on the table. This is what's going on for me. I think I'm going to get fired. Here's what's going on for me. My wife just left me. I just got diagnosed with some significant illness. And to have, in our model, we have 14 people in our peer groups, and Pete's a member of McKay CEO Forums, and he's familiar with what we do, just to create, I call it a sacred space. It seems 17 years later, it seems ridiculous for me to be saying it's even lonelier at the top, because there's an exponential change world that we live in. We've all been through this pandemic. It's heartbreaking for me to see so many people, and all my work, and we've worked with 1,200 CEOs, executives, business owners. There's never been a time where people are lonelier. Like, this is the loneliest I've seen it. And it's so much burnout, and people are overwhelmed. They're just tired. And so it's like, this is so important for us to really understand the research around, okay, what are the things we can do to give people, every single human being? so that they know that they're not the only one that's feeling lonely. It's just normal as human beings. If we don't get to meet with people in person, we're going to feel disconnected. We're going to feel lonely. We've got this mental health crisis going on. It's getting worse. I see it because my world is working with people at the top, business leaders. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And so if we don't raise awareness, and this is some of the things I love about Pete and the work that he's done with so many of our members at MacKay forums to get people to understand, we have to raise the awareness that human connection is the prevention to burnout and our mental health crisis. And people don't realize that. They're like, so many CEOs, Connie, my CEO stories are like, okay, I get these calls. What do I do to get people like back in the office? Because like, we just got to get them back to the office so that they can be productive. And I'm like, no, actually, you need to get them back in the office so that they can get connected with other human beings, because that's what's normal as human beings. We need to be connected to other human beings to feel like the mental health and everything else. That's why you need, and you have to educate people so that they understand they're not just going back to the office because the bosses are telling them, go back to the office so you can be more productive. They're going back to the office because, number one, they can contribute to the people around them just by connecting and being a caring, vulnerable, assertive human being together. And yes, they can help themselves get lifted up, right? So it's one of these things where, and it's not just supporting people around back to the office so they can be more productive at work. It's about helping them with their family situations and their personal lives. I mean, it's real. People are going through divorces. They're getting hit with really bad health issues. And we need to have the workplace as a fundamental community of human beings coming together to support each other with all aspects of their lives, business, family, and personal. So many things that you talked about, Connie, resonated. It's like, it's so in my face. So, and that's why I'm just so committed to sharing what I've learned and continue to hang out with Pete and Paul and the GenWell Project, because it's like, how can we learn how to make a bigger difference to get people connected?
Great. Nancy, we actually, in real time, we got a question from Carolyn that I think it might be nice actually just to tackle in the moment as you're having, as we're having the conversation. She wrote, why did CEOs not consider a lack of human connection before the pandemic? And I mean, maybe that's slightly overstated, but I mean, I think to your point around lonelier than ever before, but also it feeling a lot of pressure to kind of quote unquote do something about this as it relates to return to work, all of those things. Maybe talk a little bit about, your perspective on like why now, or is this something that you feel really has always been percolating in the background?
Well, I think that's one of the most inspiring things about the pandemic. If we can look for where is the inspiration for what we've all been through over the past 3 years, it is that I have observed and witnessed CEOs, executives, and business owners showing up as caring, vulnerable, assertive human beings. That's our authentic selves, because we were forced to invite each other into our homes. Like, this is my home office. We were forced to really deal with a lot of the things going on with people, and people getting sick, and people not being able to put on a brave face and show up on the Zoom screen. And so it was like it forced this sense of urgency for us to go, well, what if I actually, when I'm at work, I just show up as a human being? And I talk about my own health issues, and I got my kids are in their 20s. They all moved back home, and that was a shock to the system, but it was great once I figured out how to manage that, right? And I've had people in my life really close to me die through COVID and what have you. So why don't we actually show up as human beings? What might that be like as an organizational culture where every person gets treated as a human being and they actually get to be themselves and tell the truth about what's going on? And one of the things through the pandemic, we surveyed our members, and I said to them, like, how can we help you through this pandemic? So many businesses were suffering. And the number one message I got was, help us figure out how to get connected. And I said, what are you talking about? Help you get connected. You're peer support. We meet with you. We're getting connected. They're like, no, we actually, we need more connection. And I thought to myself, I know what they're saying. We need more love. And so I did this whole thing on, okay, how do you love people at work? Love the people at work, and actually use the love word in a workplace, because you actually care about human beings as human beings. And when you love people, you tell the truth. When you love people, you say things like, I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling stressed out about what's going on. Like, you get to be real with everyone else. And when you love people, that's what you do. And when you love people, you catch them doing things right all day long. And so I brought this whole new language of freedom, to treat every single person as a human being and to show them love. And that was like a big, it's almost like permission. I mean, I just remember this one CEO, I was doing this workshop on love in the workplace, and he just stopped me and he said, well, I got to be honest with you, Nancy, Dr. McKay, I don't love my customers. They don't pay the bills on time, and they're very frustrating. And he just went on and talked about why he didn't love his customers. And then he stopped and he said, this is the last day I'm going to say I don't love my customers. I'm going back to my office and I'm going to tell them, if we don't love our customers, why are we doing the business that we're doing? We need to stop whining and complaining about our customers. We need to show them the love. It's COVID. It's tough for everybody. Let's stop playing the blame. That was the beginning of him transforming not only himself and realizing as a human being how he wasn't being a very caring, vulnerable sort of human being. And he created that space for all the other CEOs to go, I better start to love my employees. I better start to love my customers. Because that's what the world needs more of. So it's a bit of my rant on love, because I think that love, I haven't done the research on it, but I'm pretty sure that love creates human connection, and we just need more love in the world.
I love the sentiment, Nancy. I mean, I think it's a nice segue, Pete. I can't believe we've been talking about human connection for half an hour and you've barely had the microphone. It must be just burning for you to have the platform. But I think two things you said, Nancy, that, Pete, maybe you can touch on, because I know it's something we've had lots of conversations about, and then you'll have your own thoughts as well. But one is, Nancy, you talked about, I think, everyone is a human being, and the fact that in workplaces we have, whether it's kind of with people we're managing or managing up to, right, thinking about different levels of an organization, thinking about customers or suppliers, people that exist outside our workplace, and meeting new people versus building deeper connections with existing people. I mean, it's to me an interesting lens and an angle around the whole diversity, equity, inclusion lens, Connie, that you introduced earlier, which is we have so many diverse types of connections even, and the power of each of those to bring kind of richness to our experience. Pete, it'd be great to get, your thoughts building on what Nancy said and what Connie offered up from your own perspective, having straddled, corporate and nonprofit and community and citizen and, consumer, everything from beer to mustaches. It'd be great, to get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I think I'm pulling threads from everybody's comments. First off, it's amazing to see Nancy get so passionate about this. And 2 weeks ago, I had an opportunity to attend Nancy's conference, the Ed Summit in Toronto. I think there was 700 leaders, and there was one main topic that came out of that: people before business, people before profit, people before money, whatever phrase you want to use. And listening to Connie talk about her research and saying we need to focus on the people. And I think it's it doesn't sound like a big shift, but I think it's a gargantuan shift from where we've been for 50 to 100 years. It's always been driving for the bottom line, focus on the tactics every day to drive that. And I think what, Ram Charan, who Nancy brought as the keynote speaker to her conference, was talking about, hey, if we don't keep the people, and I'll even include the leaders in that, if we don't keep you happy and healthy, how can we drive the end results? And I've always believed, if you want somebody to run through the wall for you, make sure you're taking care of that person so they have the energy and power to run through the wall. And I think oftentimes we forgot just the role. We called our people the greatest asset we have, but I don't think we truly embrace them. When I think of Connie's comments and what I love about, and this is why I'm so passionate about what we do in working with workplaces, is Connie talked about DE&I, psychological safety. She talked about, all the different ways, whether it's we can engage people, productivity, retention, attraction of the newest employees. When we think about this as the root foundation for a healthy workplace and healthy individuals, it's like the roots of the tree. If you create the human connection, the love comes because it gives us time to build trust and loyalty and all the things that lead to a successful business, whether it's on the customer front, maybe even our suppliers and partners. But when we build that holistic tree that has the root of foundation in it, to me, that's the key to success as we move forward. And to Carolyn's comment, and even John, that we didn't talk about it until now, sometimes out of great crisis comes great opportunity. And I think this is really where it is. And I will touch on one piece of Connie's research that I quote all the time. And please, Connie, tell me if I've got it wrong, because it was when you presented in the UK about the research with the Work Anywhere campaign, that 76% of employees say they find it difficult to build connections in the workplace. And so we've left human connection in the workplace up to the 24% of individuals who find it easy. But we have 76% of the people we know right now. I think it's 75% of employees are disengaged in the workplace, 15% actively. And we've left this all up to happenstance for 76% of our employees. And we can no longer let those 76% kind of meander around aimlessly because they don't feel comfortable connecting. Now we need to focus on and proactively and facilitate the human connection, not just leave it to chance.
Awesome.
Can I just jump in there? Actually, thank you, Pete. So that research that you're talking about, I will say it's we have to be careful extrapolating, statistics too far. 76% of the people we talked to said that. So I don't know, it doesn't cover the entire world. But yes, and this was collected before the pandemic, so this was a big problem. Again, going well before that. But I want to just pick up on something else, because you reminded me of that roundtable that we attended with members of Parliament. Is that this may be a little contrarian in this forum, but I really don't want to say that we have to get everybody back together in person in order to rebuild connections. I think we have to keep striving for alternatives to that. And so one of the things in the Work Anywhere project that my colleagues and I have been studying is the use of third office spaces. So those would be not your company's office and not your home, but another kind of place where you could go work, and maybe an official co-working site, or maybe something like working in a cafe or the hotel lobby. But we are finding that a lot of people find that incredibly socially fulfilling, even though they're not actually working next to people that work for the same company, but they're getting that kind of social interaction, little hallway conversations, the break room chats that actually can be rich and fulfilling as well. So that's not a non-office type of connection, but we're also looking at fully remote connections as well, whether you're doing it from your home or some other location. And there are ways to build connection that way too. In fact, on my 4 current very active research teams, I've only met one of the people I've worked with in person ever. And I've been working with them for years now. And we feel very close. I know a lot about their families and their history. And so you can do this remotely as well.
And I'll just jump in, Connie, just on that. When we do our work, we don't talk about connected workplaces. We talk about connected workforces. And so your point is totally valuable, because I think one of the biggest issues we also need to worry about is saying to the person who, we used to have our routines built into our lives. We got in the car at 8, we got to the office at 9, break was at 10:15, lunch was at noon. Well, if you're at home 3 days a week, all those routines are gone, disrupted. And now we need to actually help people reconnect those habits, routines that they had in their day. And when you don't, your neighbor may be at work and, we're randomly connecting with people. Who are you connecting with? How are you prioritizing this with your employees, but also maybe it's with your neighbor or your friend that you're going to go for a walk with at 2:00. I think it's such an important part to think of the holistic human being versus just the employee between 9 and 5 and only in the workplace. So yeah, really great call out.
And Pete, can I just, building on that, and maybe as a bit of a segue to more of an open Q&A, And as a subtle shout out to the audience, we would love your questions too. But Pete, you and I have had a lot of conversations about the need for intentionality when it comes to human connection, and I think you've all articulated versions of the where and the how, and I mean all of these things can be different, right? But if we aren't intentional about what are we doing to connect with someone that looks like they're not engaged as they normally would be, or isn't able to come in the way that they used to, or doesn't have the same opportunity, I'd love to just get people's thoughts or perspectives on this whole issue of intentionality, and then any suggestions you would have if you're a business leader, or frankly you're just an employee and you're struggling with how to do more to bring greater connection in your own experience or in your workforce, right? We'll use workforce, not workplace. I think it's well said, Pete. Thoughts on what are some simple steps that people can take? Because I think the more we can give people sort of practical, hey, here's some things to try, I think the better. So,
well, I'll jump in and say this. I totally agree with Connie that it is possible to create connection through Zoom and online and all those things. And of course, when we get to be up close and personal with other human beings, which is what we're designed to be doing, it's that next level of intimacy and connection and trust building and that kind of thing going on. And I think we have to inspire people and educate people on how that important it is. And I'll just share that my son is in his 20s. He's back home because of the pandemic. He's working full-time in a big accounting firm, and he's been online the whole time, and he's studying for a CPA. So he's totally buried. He only surfaces when he eats or to kill me in a squash game on the weekends. Anyhow, we're having dinner, and I said to him, what's it like for you? You're in your 20s and you're locked up in your room all the time, and you don't have to go meet people and what have you. He said, I love it. I am so productive. I can get up in the morning. I can work online. I can work out at lunchtime at the gym. I'm back. I'm the most productive. I don't have to spend time commuting. It doesn't cost me any money. He's got all these, and he said, I don't know why CEOs are so hung up about trying to get people back in the office. And I looked at him, I said, well, fair enough. You seem to be doing quite well, locked up in whatever. And I said to him, but here's the thing. Do you realize that your mental health and your ability to get connected to other people, and even if you feel you're okay, you could be going to the office just to even help other people and support other people that don't have it as good as you do with a nice home gym and what have you, right? So it's having these conversations one person at a time to say, well, why not go in? Even if you're feeling like you got this, you don't need that human connection. You could be helping other people. So I think we have to inspire people. We can't just say, you should do this, it's good for you. It's like, how can we appeal to their caring? Everybody's got that vulnerability, and everybody's a caring human being if you actually inspire them to understand it's not just about them. And in today's world, we have to get people to realize we all have to be, I call it game changers for each other. Like, we just have to be able to share and help and support other people, because that's what the world needs more of in today's world.
It reminds me, Nancy, at the same conference I mentioned earlier, someone said they're trying to move from me to we in their thinking, and getting that shift so that people recognize the impact that they have on other people, even if they're themselves are doing well. And I agree with that. I think we're fighting headwinds on that, I think, as a society, and how work has evolved over time. But I do appreciate that as a sentiment that I think will help people see the broader picture beyond this, their own work experience. But the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about is maybe as a way that people can grasp on why it feels different now to make connections at work. I just posted about this on LinkedIn last week, but you may know Esther Perel, who is a psychoanalyst, and she's mostly had always focused on people who are in a romantic relationship and counseling them to get better. And she's moved more into the work sphere. And she was talking about, because she's seen this already in the personal realm, about how we shifted from having a very structural set of community bases and relationships that were defined by people staying in the same place in multi-generational homes and professions being passed down from one generation to the next. And so you kind of already had your people built in when you were born that you could access if you wanted. And now we're so dispersed on all that transient nature. We have so much, I've been thinking about this term, relationship turnover is just so high in our world. And Esther would say that's because we've gone to more of a network series of relationships. When that means, if you think about what network is, it's like one node at a time, one bridge at a time that we make to other people. And I think that is one explanation for why it feels exhausting and daunting to do all those intentional efforts to make those bridges and reach out and think of other people besides yourselves. But if you realize that there really isn't an alternative unless we go back to a highly structured, stable set of environments, which I don't think we're going to do, it is the only way as a social species we're going to survive. If it's up to us, we have to start thinking about that way. It's not going to be handed to us. We have to make those relationships.
Great. Pete, any thoughts as well, just building on or kind of on what Nancy and Connie shared?
Yeah, one thing, Connie, I'd be curious of your response of, I understood, I think a lot of us that had connections before we got to the pandemic were able to, like, I just saw a friend last night who I hadn't seen for 2.5 years. And as soon as we started chatting, we went right back into, hey, remember when? And so those who had a relationship before, certainly, we can lean on those past experiences at face to face. And I think, Nancy, you touched on it a bit. I think digital technology, and I know the research shows that a Zoom call for some people can be almost like being face to face if you're the type of person who brings energy to that conversation. But over time, the research suggested that even that little gap over time will eventually erode the relationship that you have with that person. And Nancy, to your point, that if we don't actually get time face to face with people and have those conversations around the edges over a cup of coffee, over a meal, over a beer, whatever the case may be, that I do believe that trust and loyalty and things, if you've never had that past relationship, do you think that over time that will have a negative impact on the way in which those people can work together when they don't have those meaningful moments in person? I don't know if there's any research that actually goes to that yet, where you can do the comparative.
Are you asking me or Nancy?
Yeah. No.
Well, we're learning a lot, but things have changed. So what you do have to realize that historical research on just that kind of degradation of relationships over remote work were done among a population that was the minority of the workforce prior to the pandemic. So yes, I think I don't want to throw out all that literature, but a lot of those negatives associated with remote work were because it was a very small group of people. They were usually the outliers, and they had a really hard time keeping up with everybody else who's already, who's in the office and in person. And now that we've swept the tide the other direction, I think we don't know yet if that's still true. I do know that in some Microsoft research, they showed the people who fared really well in that first year of the pandemic in terms of staying connected were those who'd already experienced being remote. So there's a learning curve. And I think we can get better at it, again, over time because of that. But I'm also not opposed to in-person. I don't want that to come across either. It's the ideal, but I think of it like a big blanket. It sort of wraps everybody up into a big snuggle fest, and it makes things easier. But the reality is that you're also only capturing the people who fit under that blanket. So there's so many people who get left out from relying on in-person interactions too. And the way people make friendship, it's based, the first and most common one is proximity, actual amounts of people you work near, you live near, and those tend to drive relationships. And so again, there's concern that I have about bringing some people back to the office and leaving some people out, is that you're going to create those subgroups that we have to be careful about. The second characteristic that tends to drive friendships is homophily, and that means just finding people like you, look like you, have similar backgrounds, same age kids, things like that. And that's, again, not a bad thing, but if we only rely on that, we're not going to get diverse networks. And then, so the only thing that you could do to be intentional to create those more inclusive types of relationships in the workplace would be to create shared experiences. And that is, we know this from longstanding marital counseling, that those things can kind of rejuvenate a relationship if you were feeling it flag over a remote. And that might be every 6 months to bring people back and you spend 2 days together. So I think there are ways, again, that you can bridge remote and in person in a way that allows you to offset whatever the negatives of either mode are.
Well, and I think it takes energy, at least this is what I experienced, to get back to in person. And I remember we had one of our big breakfast events here in Vancouver in person after the pandemic. We were able to meet, and we had 100 people, CEOs showing up for the breakfast event. And one of the CEOs walked up to me and said, "You know what, Nancy, I thank you for putting this on. I literally 10 times this morning almost decided not to show up. I had to get dressed. I'm just out of the routine. I don't even know if I know how to talk to other people, literally." And so when you think about it, we all want to help people get connected, and we have to relearn what's that like to get excited about hanging out with other people. And then he said, "Well, now that I've done this, I'm not going to cancel all the other stuff I've got going on because it wasn't so difficult. And yes, I had to get dressed up and I had to drive and whatever." So it's like one of these things where I think we have to realize, and again, have some compassion and inspire people around, why don't you come together and not judge. That's the other thing. I want to live in a world that's judgment free, and we're all on a different path of reconnecting with other human beings in person and what have you. And so it's be judgment free around how we can bring people back into the office and getting connected, and recognizing some people will be at a faster pace and have different circumstances. And that's I'll just say something about diversity and inclusion. Again, a lot of judgment. It's heartbreaking for me. People judging people about, Pete's not in the office and Paul is and this and whatever. And it's again, can we just remind each other, let's park our egos. Let's not make other people wrong. Let's just honor and respect that we all have to be inspiring other people and not judging, because people are at a different pace of it's almost like reintegrating into the real world, right?
Yeah, Nancy, it's so important. We just did our study, the Canadian Social Connection Survey. 31% of people are still fearful of COVID. So we really are dealing with a spectrum of people. There's the people who feel comfortable in getting connected, those who don't even want to leave their house yet, and then there's a whole range of people in here. And so what we need to do is create that opportunity for people to connect the way they want. And I think when we think, and again, Connie, you touched on it, we need to think about the holistic human being. The first thing we need to do is say, you need to get connected, whether that's with the neighbor because you're at home, whether that's because you go to a third place, you go to a WeWork or another workplace, or you're going back to the office. Now, I also want you to understand the benefits of working with your fellow employees, because there's 100 benefits that come from that. But I also think you need to know that just talking to your neighbor reduces your sense of loneliness by 3 times. Talking to strangers on the street increases your happiness. It has the potential to increase your happiness by 3 times. That's coming out of the Canadian Social Connection Survey. So when we articulate for everybody all the benefits that come from each of these potential opportunities to build healthier social health in their life, I believe that people will make choices. We've been educating people on exercise in Canada for 52 years, eating well for 80 years. We know about sleep and we know about water. We know, fruit and vegetables, all those things. We've never spent a minute educating people on social health. And the time is now to start, raising the consciousness. And then as I think a result of that, Paul, your point, intentionality. Let's put this in the calendar like we do our going to the gym or buying the groceries and making sure we get fruit the We need to make sure that social health is a part of each and every day.
So a couple thoughts that I'd like to then leave based on the tremendous conversation that we've just had, and then being mindful of everyone's time. I've got to do a quick thank you and goodbye. So I heard a couple of things, Connie and Nancy, in your remarks I just wanted to touch on. So one, we talked about, it's really about the power of connection, the power and importance of connection. It's the where of that isn't the thing to focus on, right? It's the doing it, right, that matters, the finding time for it, the intentionality around it. I think the second thing we heard is not just with the usual suspects, right? So if we think about inclusivity, if we think about diversity of opinion, it's sort of not lapsing back to, well, I know Carl already, so I'm just going to kind of connect with Carl. It's as leaders and I think as people finding ways to make sure that everyone is included and all voices are heard and that we're actively seeking out new connections. That's the second kind of piece I heard. And the third piece I heard, Connie, and I want to come back to kind of some of your remarks is, it's not easy and there isn't a simple fix, right? I mean, I think it's really important to acknowledge for people in the audience, for people in their day-to-day, it's okay for this to feel hard. It's okay for it to feel uncomfortable. Nancy, to your point around, the colleague who had to find pants and figure out how to drive into the, all those things, right? Like, there are just practical realities around the new normal that we're all trying to find that make this not easy, but I think a journey well worth taking. So with that, I want to thank first our audience, all of you, for joining today. It's been great having you listen in on this conversation, and I hope you've taken some things from it. I want to say thank you to the three of you. It's always a pleasure to be able to spend time with you, and I really want to appreciate each of your perspectives on this issue. And the last thing I want to do before we sign off is I want to challenge each of us. That's the four of us and all of you listening in today, and anyone who listens to one of these snippets on an ongoing basis. Take one of the lessons. Take something that intrigued you from this session today, an insight, an idea, a tip, a trick, and apply it in your own life and workplace in the next 30 days, right? Conferences too often are talk and not action. And on human connection, we need to act. So thank you. Thank you to my panelists. Have a great rest of the Human Connection Conference, and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Bye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.